Fearless adventurers looked to the task before them. Although the land was wild and untamed, they knew that individually they had a duty to their compatriots. Relic, a ranger of the dark forest of the north, stepped to the front of the party, certain that his years in the wild would ensure them to pass without incident. Knowing that food was in short supply due to having their supplies ravaged by hungry beasts, Veliana, a rogue with deadly talents for archery, stepped up to find wild game that they could share at camp. Talador the mage readied his quill and parchment to map the surrounding area, knowing that this would aid them in their return to the city following their current endeavors. Shali the fighter took it upon herself to keep her keen eyes on the surrounding force, knowing that at any moment death could come looking for them. Hello, my denizens of the Underdark. Welcome to the Dungeon Delvers Lab. Before we get started, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button down below. Also, make sure you hit the bell so you can get notified as we release new videos. And tonight we're going to be continuing our discussion of wilderness adventures. And we're now going to move into getting into a little bit more of the mechanics beyond just moving across the map. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the roles that party members can take on while they're traveling with the group. And then we're going to start looking at some of the mechanics that we're going to associate with resolving hexes and resolving watches. So when we're beginning our overland adventure, the first thing that we want to make sure is we want to make sure that we get our players to assign some sort of marching order. And what this is going to determine is it's really going to help us determine when threats are coming upon the party, how we can resolve those in gameplay. So you can think of this as if a player assigns their character to maybe scouting ahead of the party, they're going to detect a threat far longer ahead of the main vanguard. And if a player is maybe in the rear of the party, there is a good possibility that some kind of threat could sneak up upon the party, and that person may be aware, but the rest of the party may end up in a surprise situation in the first round of combat. Also, the position of where you're at in the marching order could also determine if you are able to spot hidden locations or monster layers. So if let's say the party's traveling from west to east, a player that's positioned themselves on the southern side of the marching formation is going to have an easier time noticing layers or locations that could possibly be to the south of the party, as opposed to somebody who's on the northern side of the formation. So when we're establishing our marching order, it doesn't have to be really extravagant. What we could ask the players to do, and which is common at my table, is we will, on our battle grid, do something like set our miniatures out in a very organized manner of how we view our party as traveling. Another option is just simply have the party write down on a sheet of paper that you can reference what their standard marching formation is. You'll want to make sure that when they're making changes to this, though, that they're constantly updating it, that you're constantly updating as the dungeon master, so that you're always aware of where everybody is in the group. When the party finally does begin their wilderness adventure, they're not only going to have to establish their marching order, but each player is going to want to give their character a role. And in general, there's about 5 roles that the players can take on. The first is the navigator. And the navigator is typically going to be the one leading the main party group. You may have scouts ahead, but the navigators, really their primary role is they're making sure that the party doesn't get lost while traveling overland. So typically, we're going to be making a survival check, and so we're going to want probably our wisest character out front, or somebody with a proficiency in their survival skill. If a ranger is available, though, that's going to be your best bet. Simply because when they're in their favorite terrain, they can't get lost. It's important to not get lost because, remember, getting lost is going to lead to a loss of resources, and it's all, from things like camping, having to camp out, or encounters that are going to waste spell slots and use our potions, or other expendables that we have, ammunition. The next role that the players can take on is the forager. When we're traveling overland, there are going to be times where the players have either not purchased enough rations, or they don't have enough water to supply them for the entire journey. So they're going to have to rely on the land to take care of them. So foragers are tasked with locating food and locating water for the party. The difficulty of foraging, of course, is also going to depend on the terrain. And in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there's actually a great chart that you can reference for determining how hard it is for the players to find water and food. And if you go back to the document I referenced in the first episode, Fulvano's Guide to the Wilderness, you'll notice that there's also checks that can be made for either unclean water or unclean food, and that's kind of a neat addition to the game if you really want to get more into the survival mechanism. And keep in mind, the players don't only have to attempt foraging while they're traveling overland. They can also, when setting up camp, there's going to be some downtime before they actually settle in for the night and they start their watches. So what you could do is you could give the characters an opportunity then, perhaps maybe cutting out an hour of time, for the foragers to go out and try to forage while they're setting up camp, and give them enough time to prepare meals and get the rest for the night. The next role that we're going to look at is those characters that are keeping watch. Now, you have to keep in mind that if a player has chosen for their character to perform one of the other actions, such as being the navigator, being a forager, being a cartographer, unless they're a ranger, they're not going to be able to contribute to the watch. And the way that we're going to determine whether the watch is able to detect a threat is, unless they're explaining to you how they're actively conducting their watch, you're going to want to use a passive perception check for the whole party. If it's a general threat upon the party, I would say make it a group check, where we're looking for more successes than we are failures with each player, and if they get more successes, they succeed on the check. But this may change. If, let's say, a threat is coming from a particular direction, we as the Dungeon Master may determine that only certain players are going to be able to contribute to detecting that threat. And we also want to consider how large the threat is. But most importantly, what we want to do is we always want to be aware of who is eligible for detecting that threat. This just adds a little bit of common sense realism to traveling overland. Another role that we're going to want to look at is we're going to look at tracking. And when the characters are traveling overland, there is oftentimes they're going to be tracking an enemy of some kind. And when we're doing this, there's a lot of factors that are going to play into their success at tracking, and when we're going to make those tracking checks. So things like weather are really going to determine how well the players are able to track a target. We're also going to need to consider things like when they cross over things like a river, or if there's a change in terrain that could affect the pathing of their query. And finally, we're going to look at the cartographer. So it's a good idea to make sure that somebody in the party is creating the map as they're traveling overland. And there's a couple different ways you could do this. One of the ways that my group does it at our table is whoever takes on the role of the cartographer we're going to make sure that they have the cartographer tools from the player's handbook. And this is just more of a record keeping thing than anything. And it just adds to a bit of the roleplay realism of the situation. But the relationship between the Dungeon Master and the cartographer is pretty important. So while your characters are traveling, you're going to want to be descriptive as possible, but you don't want to overload the cartographer with unnecessary information. definitely don't suggest just saying, looking at the situation, okay, this hex is trees, this hex is hills. Give them a little bit more description than that, but you don't want to get into these long diatribes of description where by the time you get done, the cartographer's looking at you and thinking, I have no idea what you just said. Okay. So in this regard, you want to help them as much as you possibly can. And this is going to make your cartographer, it's going to give them a sense of accomplishment as they're building that map, and then they're going to have that map to reference, throughout your game. Once we have established these roles that our characters can take on, what does that look like necessarily mechanically? There's a couple different ways you can go about it. You can either choose to resolve situations based on the hex that the characters are currently in, or you could resolve it by the watch. At my table, the method I take is I will resolve all these situations using the watch, as we discussed in the first video of the series. But I have seen groups use the hex resolving by the hex pretty successfully. Now, if you do it by the hex, you're going to have to consider the fact that if they're moving in open land, you're probably going to be making more checks than you typically would if you were simply going through the watch. And that that could possibly lead to a significant slowdown in play. But again, it's going to be up to what your table likes and what they enjoy. When we begin our overland travel, the first thing that we're going to want to do is have the players declare the speed that they're going to be traveling that day. And as you saw in the previous video, the speed is going to determine how far they're going to be able to travel. But you also want to keep in mind that it's also going to determine, are they going to be able to move with stealth? Are they going to be able to actually track a query during that particular watch or in that hex? Once we know the speed that they're traveling, then we can make a check for if they're getting lost. And we'll revisit the getting lost procedure at the end of this video, because there's a couple different ways it can be handled. The next thing you want to do is have your players start declaring their actions. If players are going to be foraging during that watch, you'll want to have them make their checks to see, are they able to bring back food? Are they able to bring back water? Are they able to bring back enough for the party? Or are they only be able to get some for themselves? The next thing you're going to want to check is, are there any random encounters that occur during this watch or in this hex? And when they're traveling, don't think of random encounters as, I think it's wrong to think of random encounters as just being a creature encounter. Random encounters are also going to include things like NPCs that the characters may stumble upon. In a previous game, at my table, the characters actually encountered a ranger that was out hunting that was able to provide them with pretty accurate information about a keep that they were trying to infiltrate. It may also be natural phenomena can also be a natural random encounter. And we'll go more into depth in this in the next video, because really random encounters are to me the meat and potatoes of the wilderness campaign, besides the resource management aspect. So we also want to give our characters a chance, for those that are going to be acting as watch, let them know that they have the ability to not just be watching, but also some can even break out and be searching the hex, and acting as scouts. So when we have hidden items within a hex, such as a lair or a building or some kind of magical location, we want to give our characters an opportunity to find that. And so we want to use those standing watch as kind of scouts on of the main vanguard to be looking for those items in the hex. And that could be a simple investigation check. It could be a perception check, depending on the situation. If they're not actively searching the hex or searching the area during the watch, we're going to want to rely on their passive perception as a group when we're establishing whether they are able to detect an incoming threat or detect a location nearby. And the way I do this at my table is I do it as a group check, where we're looking for the largest number of successes to failures out of those that are actively watching and scouting. Now, the number of people that can contribute to this group check is also going to be determined by go back to that marching order. Are they in a position that they could feasibly detect the threat coming? If it's coming from the opposite side of the marching order, would somebody on the northern side of the marching order be able to detect the threat that's coming from the southern side? This is going to cause moments in play where you only have two individuals in the party per se that can actually act in that first round of combat while the others are surprised, and it's going to really build the tension of the experience of adventuring in the wild. Next, at the end of the day, we're going to then be looking at setting up camp. And when the players are setting up camp, I would encourage you to get them to really kind of tell you how they're setting up their camp. Because again, this is going to determine things like who can detect a threat, or how natural phenomena in the environment as weather changes, how that's going to impact them. But also remember that before they actually lay for the night, they're going to be able to have some downtime. And this is a good opportunity that if the players hadn't foraged during the initial watch, and everyone was acting as a scout or a lookout of some kind rather than foraging, this gives them one last chance to forage for food and water before the end of the day. This is also a good time then to kind of have them come up with their watch schedule. And the watch schedule then is going to determine which characters of the party are going to be aware of any kind of threats that come that are generated during a random encounter through the course of the evening. So let's now talk about getting lost. And I think this is one aspect of the wilderness adventure that a lot of dungeon masters are intimidated by, and generally just how you referee the situation. There are different ways to do this. If you look back in the original first edition Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide, Gary Gygax had suggested essentially keeping a secret map from the players where the dungeon master is tracking them, and you're continuing to describe to the players the environment, but you're not necessarily they don't know that they're off track. And the dungeon master, on the other hand, is keeping a secret map of where their actual location is, while the players are filling in their map with now this false information that isn't in the appropriate place in relation to the other geography around them. And in theory, I love this concept. I think it really does add to the tension of overland travel. Where I see it always mechanically break down is then determining when do they finally realize they're lost. How do you rectify the map between what the players have now and what the dungeon master has, and is it appropriate to rectify that map? So what I find interesting is in 5th edition, the suggestion of when the players become lost, we now do a 1d6 roll to determine how many hours they remain lost. And then we determine, then we allow them to make another check to see if they realize that they're lost. What I think is interesting about this concept is it abstracts away a mechanically obtuse part of the game. What losing time from being lost does is it goes back to the idea that when we're traveling overland, we are very concerned about resources. So getting lost for 1d6 hours is very much going to impact the resources that the players have available, be it rations, be it water, be it spell slots when random encounters occur during this lost situation. So I think it's it's a good idea possibly for newer DMs to use this method as opposed to the old school way of falsifying map information while the Dungeon Master keeps a secret map of players' locations. And it also, it's a little smoother in play, in my experience. So it's actually a method I've switched to. I used to do the secret map, but it always became very cumbersome, and it became a real issue of trying to make sure that the players had adequate information and finding new ways to hint to them, oh, you're not where you think you are. So you're always coming up with ways. Do you mention that they keep passing the same thing again? And would they necessarily notice that they're passing the same thing over and over again? But if you have a ranger in the party, you don't have to worry about that. So I want to thank you guys for checking out this video. In the next video, what we're going to be covering is we're going to be looking deeper into what kind of random encounters the players can face during an adventure in the wilderness, and we're going to expand on the idea of what a random encounter is. We're not going to look at it just simply as a player versus creature situation. We're going to look at what types of NPCs the players are going to encounter in the wilderness. What does natural phenomena, what role does that play in overland travel? Can locations be random encounters? So yeah, I look forward to getting that video together for you, and I'll see you next time. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can find us at Dungeon Delvers. If you want to follow us on Instagram, be sure to find us at Dungeon Delvers Laboratory. And if you want to find us on the web, we're at DungeonDelversLab.com. Thank you.